47 birthday cards arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, and that was only the first truck. The boy standing in the doorway of the Meade County group home on Highway 79 did not know what to do with his hands. He was 12 years old that day, and until 9:17 that morning he had believed, with the quiet certainty of a child who has learned not to expect anything, that the day would pass like all the others. Breakfast at 7, school at 8, the long institutional afternoon, lights out at 9. Nobody had told him anything different. Nobody had told him anything at all. What happened instead, on that flat gray Tuesday on the high grassland east of the Black Hills, is the part that nobody who was there has ever been able to explain without stopping to collect themselves. 200 motorcycles came over the ridge on State Route 79 in a line that stretched so far back into the pale November sky that the last riders were invisible, and every single one of them was carrying something the boy had never once in his life received. The reason they came is the part that takes some knowing. The morning had started the way most mornings started for Garth Wills, which was cold and with the particular low-grade ache that settles into a man's lower back when he has slept on a bunk that was built for someone 30 years younger and 60 pounds lighter. He was 53 years old, and he carried every one of those years in his spine, in the deep grooves that weather and work had pressed into his face, and in the white that had overtaken his beard so completely that people who met him for the first time tended to take half a step back before they caught themselves. He was not a tall man, but he was broad in the shoulders in the way that comes from decades of lifting real weight rather than from a gym, and his hands were the hands of someone who had spent 30 years doing things with them that left marks. The knuckles on his right hand had been set crooked twice, and the pad of his left thumb was missing the top quarter-inch, taken by a chain guard in 1999 in a repair shop outside Rapid City that no longer existed. He wore a black canvas vest with the Northgate Riders patch on the back, a wheat-colored bison skull on a field of dark blue, and the patch had been there so long that the threads had begun to pull at the bottom left corner in a way he kept meaning to have fixed and never did. He had been riding with the Northgate Riders for 26 years. He had held the road captain position for 7 of those years and the vice president position for 4, and now he held no position at all, which was the way he preferred it. The oldest man in the club did not need a title to be heard. He had pulled off Route 79 that morning not because of the boy. He had pulled off because his rear tire had developed a shimmy somewhere around the Sturgis cutoff, and he wanted to check the pressure before he pushed another 30 miles into the wind. The group home was the first flat lot he found, a low brick building set back from the highway behind a chain-link fence with a painted sign that read Sunrise Youth Services, in letters that had once been cheerful and were now simply weathered. He walked his bike to the edge of the lot and crouched down beside the rear wheel, and that was when he saw the child. The boy was sitting on the top step of the building's front entrance with his arms wrapped around his knees and his chin resting on his forearms, watching the highway with the focused, patient attention of someone who is waiting for a specific thing and has been waiting for a long time. He was slight, dark-haired, wearing a gray sweatshirt that was about one size too large and jeans that had been hemmed unevenly. His sneakers were clean, which told Garth something. The rest of the picture told him something else. There was nobody with him. There was no car in the lot that looked like a visitor's car. The front door of the building was closed. The boy was watching the highway and not the parking lot, which meant he was not waiting for someone to pull in. He was watching for something coming down the road, something that had not come. Garth checked his tire pressure, 102 pounds per square inch, which was fine. He straightened up and looked at the boy again. The boy had not moved. Garth walked his bike back toward the road, stopped, and looked at the boy a third time. The boy still did not look at him. His eyes were fixed on the southbound lane of Route 79 with an expression that was not hope, exactly, and was not grief, exactly, and was the specific combination of those two things that a person's face makes when they have been hoping for long enough that hope has started to calcify into something harder and less yielding. Garth had seen that expression before. He knew exactly where he had seen it, and the memory arrived in his chest like something dropped from a height, and he stood in the parking lot for a long moment without moving, and then he walked toward the steps. "You waiting on somebody?" he said. It was not quite a question. The boy looked at him then, and what crossed his face in that first second was not fear. It was the careful, evaluating steadiness of a child who has learned to read adults quickly and accurately because the cost of misreading them is too high. He looked at Garth's vest, at the patch, at the beard, at the size of him. Then he looked back at the highway. "My dad said he'd come," the boy said. "He knows it's my birthday." Garth did not say anything. He sat down on the bottom step. "He might just be late," the boy said. "Traffic or whatever." Garth looked out at Route 79. A semi rolled past, southbound, and the wind came off it and moved the boy's hair. The highway was otherwise empty in both directions, for as far as a man could see. "What's your name?" Garth said. "Marcus," the boy said. "Marcus Elroy." "How long you been out here, Marcus?" Marcus looked at the horizon with the careful focus of someone doing arithmetic they are not sure about. "Since 6, he said. It was 10:47 in the morning. Garth Wills looked down at the cracked concrete of the step and looked at his boots and looked at nothing, and something moved through him that he could not have named and would not have tried to. He pulled out his phone. He pressed a contact that said Donnie Cirked and let it ring. Donnie Frazier, Sergeant-at-Arms for the Northgate Riders, answered on the second ring with the clipped one-syllable greeting he used when he was already in the middle of something. "Yeah." "Where are you right now?" Garth said. "Just past Tilford. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Garth said, and paused and looked at Marcus Elroy sitting on the step watching the highway for a car that was not going to come. "I need you to make some calls." There was a silence on the line that lasted 2 seconds, which from Donnie Frazier was a long silence. "How many calls?" Garth thought about the boy's face. He thought about what it costs a person, even a small person, to sit in the cold for 4 hours and 47 minutes watching a road for someone who said they would come. He thought about a specific night in 1987 when he had been the one sitting on a step in the dark, and that memory was one he kept in a locked room in himself and almost never opened, but it opened now without his permission, and it stayed open. "Every number you have," Garth said. "Tell them I need them here. Tell them to bring whatever they've got." Donnie said, "Give me the address." Garth read it off the sign above the door. Donnie said, 2 hours. Garth put his phone away and sat back down on the bottom step. Marcus Elroy was still watching the highway. The sky over the black hills to the west had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind off the grassland came in long, cold pulls that smelled of dry grass and distance. "You eaten today?" Garth said. "Breakfast," Marcus said. "You want something?" Marcus looked at him sidelong. "I'm supposed to stay here, in case he comes and doesn't see me." Garth nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll stay here then." He meant it. He did not go anywhere. He sat on that bottom step for the next hour and 50 minutes and watched the same highway Marcus was watching, and he did not say much, and Marcus did not say much. And between them on the cold concrete there was the particular quiet of two people who have agreed, without using any words to agree, that they are going to wait together. A woman in a blue cardigan came to the door once, looked at Garth with the expression he was used to seeing on the faces of people who had never met him before, something between alarm and the reaching for a phone, and Garth looked back at her with the same flat steadiness he used for everything and said, "Morning." She stood there for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus. Then she looked back at Garth and said, "Can I help you?" in a tone that meant something different from the words. Garth said, "We're just sitting." She stayed in the doorway for another moment, then went back inside and came back 4 minutes later with a cup of cocoa that she handed to Marcus without looking at Garth again, and then she left. Marcus held the cup in both hands and let the steam come up against his face. "She's okay," he said, of the woman who had gone. "She works here," Garth said. "Yeah." He could hear motorcycles now, still a long way off, still just a low vibration in the air that most people would not have been able to separate from the wind. Marcus heard it too. He turned his head slightly, the way a person does when they are trying to locate a sound. "What's that?" he said. Garth Wills looked at the ridgeline where Route 79 crested before it came down into the flat. He could see nothing yet. In 30 seconds that was going to change. "That's some people I know," he said. "How many people?" Marcus said. Garth thought about the calls Donnie would have made, and the calls that Donnie's contacts would have made, and the way that a message moved through the Northgate riders and through the networks that connected the Northgate riders to every group of riders across western South Dakota, and he thought about what he had said when Donnie asked him what to tell people, and what Garth had said was simply this: "There is a boy who is 12 years old today, and he is waiting at a highway address in Meade County, and he has not received a birthday card in his life, and we are going to change that." That was all he had said. He had not asked anyone to come. He had stated the situation and left the decision where it belonged. "A few," Garth said. He was watching the ridge. The sound was building now, low and rhythmic and continuous, coming up through the soles of his boots from the road. Marcus Elroy set his empty cocoa cup down on the step beside him and turned to face the highway with both feet planted and his hands on his knees, and his face had changed. The careful, flat patience was still there, but underneath it something else had begun to surface, something unguarded and young that he had not let show before, and Garth Wills watched the first riders come over the ridge in a line that went back farther than he could follow, and he looked at the boy beside him, and he did not say a word. The first 4 riders were Donnie Frazier and 3 men who had been at the Saturday run the week before and had ridden through the night to get here. Donnie pulled into the lot and cut his engine and swung off his bike and reached into the inside pocket of his cut and took out an envelope that was slightly bent at one corner and walked up to the bottom step and crouched down to the boy's eye level. He had a face that had been broken at least once and a forearm tattoo that a courthouse artist would not have approved of, and he held out the envelope with both hands as if it were fragile. "Happy birthday, bud," he said. Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at Donnie. He reached out and took it with both hands, holding it the same careful way, and he didn't open it, just held it. And the second wave of riders was already turning into the lot behind the first 4, 10 of them, 15, their engines dropping to idle and then going quiet one after another in a rolling sequence that moved through the lot like something breathing out, and with each engine that went silent, another rider was already reaching into a pocket or a saddlebag or the chest of a cut and coming out with an envelope. The woman in the blue cardigan, whose name was Renata Voss, and who had worked at Sunrise Youth Services for 11 years, and who would later say that she had never in those 11 years been surprised by anything, came out the front door of the building because the sound had reached a volume that made the windows vibrate gently in their frames, and she stood on the top step and looked at the parking lot and the road beyond it, and she put one hand over her mouth. The lot held 40 vehicles comfortably. By 11:38 it held 62 motorcycles with more still arriving, and the overflow had moved off the lot and onto the gravel shoulder of Route 79, and a South Dakota Highway Patrol unit had slowed and pulled in at the edge of the lot, and the trooper had gotten out of his vehicle and stood beside it for a moment taking in the scene, and then he had gotten back in his vehicle and driven away without stopping, which Garth noticed and catalogued and appreciated. By noon, the count was 111. By 12:40, it was 160. By 1:15 in the afternoon, when the last riders came over the ridge and the sound crested one final time, and then began to settle. The count stood at 203. Marcus Elroy had not moved from the step. He sat with both feet planted and his hands in his lap and a growing stack of envelopes beside him on the concrete that had started at one and was now a pile so thick it had begun to lean, and Garth Wills sat beside him on that same bottom step and watched the boy's face with the same quiet attention a person gives to something they know they are only going to see once. The riders did not crowd the boy. They came in ones and twos, crouching down or kneeling on the cold concrete so that they were at his level, and they held out their envelopes, and they said happy birthday, or they said, hey kid, this is for you, or they said nothing at all and simply offered the envelope and waited, and Marcus took each one with both hands, holding them all. He had stopped trying to say thank you after the first 20 because the words had started coming apart in his mouth. He held the stack of envelopes against his chest with both arms the way a person holds something they are afraid of dropping, and he did not cry, not quite, but his face had opened in a way that made it clear how long it had been closed. Renata Voss came down from the top step and stood behind the boy, not intrusively, just present, the way a person stands when they want someone to know there is something solid behind them. She was crying, which she was not embarrassed about. Two of the riders near the steps were crying in the flat-faced way of people who are not accustomed to it and are not going to acknowledge it. Garth Wills was not crying. He was watching the road, the old reflex, and his face was doing what his face always did, which was nothing that a stranger would have been able to read. But his right hand, which was resting on his knee, had closed into a fist so tight that the crooked knuckles had gone white. There was a man he had not been able to get to in time. This was the locked room, the one that had opened in the parking lot and had not closed since. The man's name did not need to be spoken here and would not be. What needed to be said was only this. In 1987, when Garth Wills was 19 years old and newly arrived in Rapid City from a situation he had left without looking back, there had been a boy very much like Marcus Elroy. Not in a group home, but in a different kind of loneliness that amounted to the same thing. And there had been a birthday, and a door that was supposed to open and did not open, and Garth had been the one on the step, and there had been nobody sitting beside him. Nobody had called anyone. Nobody had come over any ridge. He had sat there until it got dark, and then he had gone inside, and he had folded that day up very small and put it somewhere he rarely looked, and he had spent the next 34 years becoming, by slow degrees, the kind of man who was very good at watching roads and very slow to let anyone sit beside him. He did not know, sitting on the Sunrise Youth Services front step at 12:43 on a cold November Tuesday, whether what he was doing now was rescue or restitution. He suspected it was both. He suspected that was the only kind that counted. Donnie Frazier had been moving through the crowd with a notebook, writing names and phone numbers in his cramped left-handed script. He came back to the step and crouched down and showed Garth the notebook. Garth looked at the tally at the bottom of the page. 203 riders, 203 envelopes in the stack that Marcus Elroy was holding against his chest, Donnie said quietly so the boy would not hear. There were guys who couldn't ride today. They're mailing them. Garth looked at him. Donnie said, 40, maybe 50 more. He paused. Card shop in Rapid City called me, said they sold out of birthday cards this morning. Whole section gone by 9 a.m. He was not smiling when he said it. He was saying it as a fact, the way you say a fact that is also too large for any other register. Garth looked back at the highway, at the 203 motorcycles lining the lot and the shoulder of Route 79, at the 203 men and women who had come over the ridge of a county highway on a cold Tuesday morning because a phone call had moved through the right network at the right moment. And he thought about the shimmy in his rear tire that had made him pull off in the first place, and he thought about all the things that had to happen exactly as they happened for him to be sitting on this particular step at this particular time. and he could not decide whether the word for that was luck or something else entirely. He decided it did not matter what the word was. Marcus Elroy opened his first card around 1 o'clock, when the crowd had settled and the sound had given way to voices and the occasional engine ticking as it cooled. He opened it carefully, working the flap loose without tearing it, and inside was a card with a cartoon of a dog wearing a party hat. And inside the card was a $5 bill and a note in a handwriting that Marcus studied for a long moment before reading aloud. It says, "Kid, I don't know you, but you deserve a good one. 12 is a big deal. Don't let anybody tell you different." From Tuck. Marcus looked up from the card. Somewhere in the crowd, a large man with a red beard raised a hand without looking up from the conversation he was in. Marcus looked back at the card. "Is Tuck always like that?" he asked. Garth said, "Pretty much." Marcus nodded, seriously, as if this were useful information. He set the card carefully in his lap and opened the next one. He opened all 203 of them that afternoon, sitting on the front step of Sunrise Youth Services, with the November light going long and gold across the grassland. It took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Renata Voss brought out a folding table at some point, and the cards went on the table in a row as Marcus opened them, and the row became 2 rows and then 3, and then overflowed onto the second folding table that a man named Pavel Critch brought out from the storage room inside, and by the time the light began to fail, the table held a landscape of paper and color that stretched almost 20 feet along the front wall of the building. $5 bills, 10s, a few 20s, small notes and handwritings ranging from careful block print to barely legible, drawings of motorcycles, of mountains, of bison. One card had a photograph tucked inside it, a faded Polaroid of a group of riders at some rally that Garth did not recognize, and on the back in ballpoint pen it said, "This is what belonging looks like." Marcus looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he put it back in the envelope carefully and held the envelope in his lap. The total in cash and checks, when Renata Voss counted it 3 days later at the kitchen table in the group home with a hand calculator and Marcus sitting across from her watching, was $4,680. A bank account was opened in Marcus Elroy's name at a branch in Sturgis on the Friday of that week, with Renata Voss as custodian, and with a notarized letter from Garth Wills, who had provided his full legal name and contact information and a brief explanation that had taken him 45 minutes to write because he was not accustomed to writing explanation. The bank officer, a woman named Carla something whose last name Garth did not catch, read the letter twice. Then she looked at Garth across the desk. Then she looked at Marcus. She said, "Give me a minute," and got up and went somewhere in the back of the bank and came back with a manager, who also read the letter and who said nothing for a moment and then said, "We can do that," in a voice that suggested the decision had been made in a different register than a business one. The account was opened. Marcus Elroy was given a small booklet with his balance printed in it, and he put it in the front pocket of his jeans and kept touching it for the rest of the day, the way a person touches something they are not quite sure is real. Garth drove out to Sunrise Youth Services twice more that November, on a Thursday and the following Monday, both times with no plan and no particular agenda. He sat on the front step. Marcus came out and sat beside him, and they watched Route 79 together, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't. On the second visit, Marcus asked him about the patch on the back of his vest, the bison skull, and Garth described the club and the country it rode through and the history of the route that the club took in summer, out through the Badlands and back up through the northern hills. Marcus listened with the focused, literal attention that children give to things they are genuinely trying to understand rather than performing interest in. And when Garth finished, Marcus said, "Does it get lonely riding like that?" Garth considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Sometimes," he said, "not as much as it used to." Marcus seemed to find this satisfactory. The following spring, in late April, when the snow had cleared off the ridges and the grassland had gone that violent green it goes for exactly 3 weeks before the summer heat flattens it back to gold, the Northgate Riders held their first annual Marcus Run. The route went out from Sturgis on Route 79 south to the Cheyenne River crossing, across the bridge, and back north on the county road, a loop of 61 miles through the country that the club had ridden for 3 decades. Garth planned the route himself, sitting at a kitchen table with a paper map and a red pen. The number of riders who showed up at the Sturgis staging area that April Saturday morning was 203, the same as the November count, which was not a coincidence because Donnie Frazier had made certain it was not. 203, not 202, not 204. The number was the number, and it would stay the number, and it meant what it meant. Marcus Elroy was there, standing near the front of the staging area with his hands in the pockets of a new gray sweatshirt that fit him correctly this time, watching the riders come in. He counted them as they arrived, moving his lips slightly, and when the 203rd rider pulled in and cut his engine, Marcus looked at Garth and said, "That's everybody." Garth said, "That's everybody." They pulled out of the staging area at 9 in the morning, Marcus riding in the middle of the pack in the truck that Renata Voss had borrowed from the group home's maintenance contractor, sitting in the passenger seat with the window down and his arm out in the cold spring air, feeling the vibration of 203 engines moving through the road beneath him. By the 3rd year, the Marcus Run had become a fixed point in the calendar of every riding group in western South Dakota. Sunrise Youth Services had refurbished its common room with a portion of the fund that the runs had built, and on the wall beside the front door, framed in plain dark wood, was a photograph taken on that first November Tuesday. A boy on a step, a stack of envelopes against his chest, and in the background, stretching all the way out to the highway and up the ridge, 203 motorcycles in a line that went farther than the frame could hold. Beneath the photograph, on a small brass plate, were the words Marcus Elroy, age 12, and the date, and nothing else. Nothing else was needed. On Garth Wills's vest, below the bison skull, below the Northgate Riders patch with its pulling thread that he had finally had someone fix, there was a new piece of embroidery, 3 inches wide, stitched by a woman named Deb Marco in Sturgis, who had been doing the club's patches for 15 years. It showed the number 203, just the number. Garth wore it every time he rode, and if anyone asked him what it meant, he said, "It means we showed up." That was the only explanation he ever gave. And after a while, in the circles where the Northgate Riders were known, it stopped needing one. Marcus Elroy turned 16 on a Tuesday in November, and this time the cars in the parking lot of Sunrise Youth Services were full of people who had put the date in their calendars years in advance. He turned 18 and left the group home and enrolled at the technical college in Rapid City, and Garth drove into the city in his truck, not on his bike because it was October and the roads had iced overnight, and he sat across from Marcus in a diner booth and drank bad coffee and listened to the boy describe his plans with the focused clarity of someone who has learned, through long practice, the difference between hoping and deciding. The booth had a window that looked out onto a side street where the morning light was coming in low and winter thin, and it caught the side of Marcus's face at an angle that made him look briefly much younger than he was, and Garth Wills looked at that and said nothing, and looked out the window, and thought about Route 79 and the shimmy in a rear tire, and all the things that have to happen exactly right for any good thing to occur. And he thought about sitting on a step in the dark in 1987 with nobody beside him. And he thought about a boy who had held 203 envelopes against his chest until his arms shook. And he thought that the distance between those 2 moments was the whole of what a life could do if you let it. You think you know what a man is by how large he looks coming over a ridge. You think you know what a road is by how empty it runs in both directions. But the road that brought 203 riders to a child on a front step was not the one on any map, and the men who rode it were not what anyone in that parking lot expected. And the boy who had been watching for a car that was never going to come looked up one morning and saw something come over a ridge that he would still be talking about when he was grown. And that is the thing about an engine sound on a cold and empty highway. You hear it first as noise, and then you hear it as arrival. And sometimes, if the morning is right and you have been waiting long enough, you hear it as the thing you did not know you were allowed to want. Marcus kept the bank booklet for 6 years. It lived in the top drawer of whatever dresser he happened to own at the time, and he never spent the original balance, the $4,680, because he had decided somewhere in the months after that November Tuesday that the original sum was not money in the ordinary sense. It was evidence. He deposited his own earnings on top of it and spent those freely enough, but the base amount sat untouched, and he checked on it the way a person checks on something they need to know is still where they left it. He told Garth about this on one of the Rapid City diner visits, matter-of-factly, the way Marcus told most things, and Garth nodded and looked at his coffee and did not say that he understood, but he did understand, completely, because he had his own version of the same thing, which was not money but a single photograph he kept in the breast pocket of his riding vest every time he went out on the road. The photograph was the one from the November count, the wide shot that Renata Voss had taken from the top step with her phone, the one where the line of motorcycles went all the way back to the ridge and disappeared. He had printed it at a pharmacy in Sturgis on 4x6 paper and folded it once along the center and carried it there against his chest for 3 years without telling anyone. Donnie Frazier found out about the photograph the way Donnie found out about most things, which was by paying attention when other people assumed he wasn't. He said nothing about it for 2 weeks after he noticed, and then one evening at the club's Tuesday gathering in the back room of a bar outside Sturgis, he raised his coffee mug in Garth's direction across the table, not a toast exactly, just a gesture, and Garth looked at him and looked away, and that was the entire conversation, and both of them understood it completely. The fourth Marcus run drew 240 riders. The fifth drew 291. By the 6th year, the route had to be extended because the staging area in Sturgis could no longer hold the count at the start, and a second staging point was added at a gravel turnout 8 miles south, where latecomers could join the line as it passed. Garth rode at the front that 6th year for the first time, which was not his custom. He had always ridden back in the pack where he could watch the whole line, but Marcus had asked him to ride front, and Marcus was 21 years old by then and no longer asking for permission for things, just stating what he wanted, with the quiet directness that he had apparently always possessed and had simply been waiting for enough stability to express. So Garth rode at the front, and the line behind him was 317 motorcycles long, and the sound of it came up through the frame of his bike and into his hands and his sternum, and the April grassland ran out flat and green on both sides of Route 79, and the sky was the particular pale blue of a morning that has just finished deciding to be clear. And Garth Wills rode 61 miles through the country he had ridden for 30 years and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was going somewhere rather than simply moving. Renata Voss retired from Sunrise Youth Services in the spring of Marcus's 23rd year. Her retirement party was held in the refurbished common room under the photograph on the wall, and Marcus drove down from Rapid City for it in the truck he had bought the previous fall, a used one with 140,000 miles on it that he had inspected himself because he had taken a course in automotive systems at the technical college and liked to know the condition of the things he relied on. He stood in the common room and looked at the photograph on the wall for a long time. Renata came and stood beside him. She said, "Do you remember what you were thinking sitting there?" Marcus said, "I was thinking he was going to want something." A pause. Most big guys who sit down next to you want something, Renata said. Did he? Marcus said, no. He said it simply, with the flat certainty of something long settled, and then he said, he just sat there. That was the whole thing. He just sat there and didn't go anywhere. Renata put her hand briefly on Marcus's arm and then moved away to speak to someone else, and Marcus stayed in front of the photograph for another minute, and in it he could see, at the very bottom left corner of the frame if you knew where to look, the edge of a boot on the second step from the bottom. Just the edge, just enough. Garth was 61 years old the spring of the 7th Marcus run, and the ride agreed with him less than it once had, specifically in the lower back and in the left knee that had been reconstructed in 2019 after an incident that had nothing to do with riding and everything to do with ice on a loading dock in February. He rode it anyway. He had ridden every one of the Marcus runs, and he intended to ride every future one for as long as he was physically capable of mounting a bike, and after that he intended to find some other way to be present for the count, even if that meant sitting in a truck on the shoulder of Route 79 and watching the line go past. He had not yet had to make that accommodation, and he did not plan for it actively. He simply knew it was there the way a person knows about a door they are not ready to open yet. Marcus called him the night before the 7th run. He called from Rapid City, where he was living in a second-floor apartment with a window that looked north toward the hills, and he talked for 20 minutes about a project he had taken on at the automotive shop where he had been working for 2 years, a full mechanical restoration on a 1974 machine that had come in barely running and would go out correct in every detail. Garth listened with the focused attention he gave to things that interested him, asking 2 or 3 specific questions, and when Marcus finished, he said, "You'll get that carburetor right." Marcus said, "I know I will." "It's just time-consuming," Garth said. "Most things that matter are." There was a comfortable silence of the kind that takes years to build. Then Marcus said, "You riding front again tomorrow?" Garth said he was. Marcus said, "Good." He said it with the same flat certainty he used for things long settled, and they said good night, and Garth sat in the quiet of the house he rented on a gravel road 5 miles off the highway and listened to the wind off the grassland move across the roof, and he thought about sitting on a step in the dark a very long time ago, and he thought about the shimmy in a rear tire. And he thought about how the distance between those two things was 61 miles of April road and a number that had grown from 203 to something larger every year, and still the number that mattered, the one stitched below the bison skull on his vest, was the original one, 203, the count on a cold Tuesday. The number of people who came over a ridge for a boy who had been watching a highway since 6 in the morning. He put on the vest the next morning in the dark before sunrise, the way he always did, left sleeve first, then right, settling the weight of it across his shoulders, the way you settle something familiar that has become part of how your body understands itself. The photograph was in the breast pocket. He had replaced it once, 3 years ago, when the original had worn through along the fold, and he had replaced it with an identical print from the same pharmacy using the same image, and the new one had begun to develop its own wear along the same fold, which was a thing he noticed and did not find sad. He went out to his bike in the pre-dawn dark and stood beside it for a moment in the cold, looking east where the sky was just beginning to separate light from dark along the edge of the grassland, a thin line of pale gray rising, and the morning smelled of frost and dry ground and distance. The same smell the grassland had been offering every November and every April for as long as he had been riding through it, and it occurred to him, standing there in the almost dark before the 7th Marcus run, that this was the smell of the morning that had changed what he thought was possible. Not the morning of the November count, but the morning after, when he had woken up in a motel outside Sturgis and lain in the dark and understood for the first time in 34 years that sitting beside someone on a cold step was something he knew how to do, that he had always known how to do it, and that the door he had kept locked since 1987 was not a wound that would not close, but a room that had simply been waiting for a use. 203. That was the number that started it. That was the drumbeat. You think the engine sound on an empty highway is noise, just cylinders and road and the wind that runs flat and cold off the Black Hills in November, and then you hear it become something else entirely. And a boy on a step lifts his head, and the hardest men you have ever seen come down off a ridge carrying something as light as paper, as weightless as a name written inside a card, and what they carry is the one thing that a child waiting on a highway since 6 in the morning needed more than warmth or food or money or any practical thing, proof that the road does not only take people away from you, sometimes, on the right morning, with enough people willing to ride, it brings them in.